Margaret Thompson never thought retirement would be this peaceful. At 67, she had spent 3 decades as the state's attorney general, dealing with criminals, corrupt politicians, and endless courtroom battles. Now she woke up every morning to the sound of her horses neighing in the pasture and birds singing in the oak trees that surrounded her ranch. Her property was a dream come true. 15 acres of rolling hills, green pastures, and the most beautiful sunsets she had ever seen. The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with a wraparound porch where she loved to sit with her morning coffee. Behind the house stood the horse stables that her late husband had built with his own hands 20 years ago. They had planned to grow old together on this land, watching their horses run free and tending to their vegetable garden. Life had other plans, though. After her husband passed away 5 years ago, Margaret thought about selling the ranch. But every time she walked through the garden he had planted or watched their horses graze in the evening light, she knew she could never leave. This place held too many memories, too much love. The ranch sat on the edge of what used to be quiet farmland. Over the past few years, developers had built a neighborhood called Pine Valley Estates right up to her property line. Margaret didn't mind the new neighbors at first. Most of them were nice families who waved when they drove by and sometimes stopped to admire her horses. Everything changed 6 months ago when the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association got new leadership. Margaret first learned about this when she found a bright orange notice stuck to her mailbox one Tuesday morning. Violation notice. It read in bold red letters, "Your property contains structures that do not meet community standards. Horse fencing must be removed within 30 days. Garden structures must conform to HOA guidelines." Margaret stared at the paper in disbelief. Her property had been there long before any HOA existed. Her lawyer had made sure of that when they bought the land. She had what they called grandfather rights, which meant the HOA couldn't force her to change anything that was already there. She drove to the HOA office that same afternoon. The receptionist, a young woman who looked barely out of college, barely looked up from her computer. "I need to speak with someone about this violation notice," Margaret said politely, placing the orange paper on the counter. "You'll need to schedule an appointment," the receptionist replied without looking up. "When's the earliest available time?" "Let me check. How about 3 weeks from Thursday?" Margaret had dealt with bureaucrats her whole career, but this was ridiculous. "This notice gives me 30 days to comply. You're telling me I can't even discuss it for 3 weeks?" The receptionist finally looked up, her expression showing no sympathy. "Those are our policies, ma'am." That evening, Margaret did what she always did when facing a legal challenge. She researched. She pulled out her property deed, the original, purchase documents, and every piece of paperwork related to her land. Everything confirmed what she already knew. Her property predated the HOA by 20 years. They had no legal authority over her existing structures. The next week, another orange notice appeared on her mailbox. This one complained about her vegetable garden, calling it agricultural activity incompatible with residential standards. The week after that, they complained about her horse riding trails, saying they created noise disturbances and unsightly paths. Margaret decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, which seemed odd. Most working people couldn't attend meetings in the middle of the afternoon. When she arrived at the community center, she found only 3 other people in the audience. The board president introduced himself as Derek Williamson. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in their small town. Margaret recognized him as a local real estate developer who had been buying up farmland around the area. When Margaret stood up during the public comment period, Derek barely let her finish introducing herself before cutting her off. "Mrs. Thompson, we're aware of your situation," he said with a condescending smile. "But times change. This community has standards now. Your property affects everyone's home values. Mr. Williamson, my property has legal protections that predate your association," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm not required to comply with regulations that didn't exist when I built my facilities." Derek's smile faded. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you Consult with a lawyer before making such claims. We have legal authority to enforce community standards on all properties within our boundaries. Margaret almost laughed. Did this man really think he could intimidate someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms? I am a lawyer, Mr. Williamson. In fact, I spent 3 decades as this state's attorney general. The room went quiet. Derek's face turned red, but he quickly recovered his composure. Well, regardless of your background, the law is the law. You'll need to comply like everyone else. After the meeting, Margaret approached Derek privately. Look, I don't want any trouble. I just want to live peacefully on my land. Surely we can work something out. Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Mrs. Thompson, I'll be direct with you. This neighborhood is growing. Property values are rising. Your little farm setup doesn't fit with our vision for this community. It would be much easier for everyone if you just sold and moved somewhere more appropriate. Now Margaret understood. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. This was about her land. Prime real estate that someone wanted to develop. Mr. Williamson, my husband and I built our life on this property. I'm not selling and I'm not moving. Derek's friendly mask slipped completely. Then you're going to find life here very difficult. We have tools at our disposal to ensure compliance. I'd hate to see an elderly woman go through unnecessary stress. Margaret had prosecuted men just like Derek Williamson. Bullies who thought money and position gave them the right to push people around. She looked him straight in the eye and spoke in the voice that had made criminals confess and corrupt officials resign. Mr. Williamson, I've dealt with much scarier people than you. If you think you can intimidate me off my own land, you're about to learn why I never lost a case in 30 years. As she walked to her truck, Margaret felt a familiar feeling in her chest. The same feeling she used to get before a big trial. Someone was picking a fight with the wrong person, and they had no idea what they were up against. Over the next month, the violation notices kept coming. Every few days, another orange paper appeared on her mailbox. They complained about everything: the color of her barn, the height of her fence posts, even the type of flowers in her garden. Each notice came with a fine of $500 per day until the violation was corrected. Margaret documented everything. She took photos, made copies, and kept detailed records of every interaction. Old habits die hard, and she had learned long ago that in any legal battle, documentation was everything. What worried her most wasn't the money or the harassment. It was the escalation. Derek Williamson and his HOA board were getting more aggressive with each passing week. Margaret had seen this pattern before in her career. People who abuse power rarely stop at verbal threats. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching her horses graze in the golden sunset light, Margaret made a decision. She had spent her career protecting people from bullies and criminals. She wasn't about to let anyone drive her off the land she and her husband had loved so much. Little did she know that Derek Williamson had already decided to take their conflict to a much more dangerous level. Margaret woke up the next morning to find 3 more orange violation notices on her mailbox. This time, they were complaining about her horse water troughs being unsightly metal containers and her garden tool shed being an unauthorized structure. The fines were adding up fast. $500 per day for each violation meant she was now facing over $15,000 in penalties. She shook her head as she walked back to the house. In all her years as Attorney General, she had seen plenty of abuse of power, but this was getting ridiculous. Derek Williamson was clearly trying to make life so miserable that she would give up and sell her property. That afternoon, while she was feeding her horses, Margaret noticed a white SUV parked on the road near her property. A man in a security uniform sat inside, holding what looked like a camera with a long lens. He was taking pictures of her ranch. Margaret walked over to the fence line. "Can I help you with something?" The security guard rolled down his window. "Just doing my job, ma'am. HOA hired us to document violations." "What violations are you documenting? Exactly?" The man looked uncomfortable. "Just general property conditions." Margaret had dealt with enough surveillance operations to know what was happening. They were building a case, documenting everything they could use against her. She took out her phone and started taking pictures of the security vehicle, making sure to get the license plate number. The guard quickly drove away. Over the next week, the surveillance became constant. Different vehicles, different guards, but always someone watching her property. They parked on the public road, so technically they weren't trespassing, but the message was clear. We're watching you. Margaret's neighbor, an elderly man named Robert who lived in the HOA community, stopped by one evening. He looked nervous as he approached her porch. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me coming by," he said, fidgeting with his baseball cap. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something." "Of course, Robert. What's going on?" "The HOA sent someone to my house yesterday. They wanted me to sign a complaint about your horses making too much noise and your property bringing down our home values." Robert looked embarrassed. "I told them your horses are quieter than most people's dogs, and I've never had any problem with your property." Margaret felt her anger rising. "Did they pressure you to sign?" "They said if enough neighbors complained, they could take stronger action against you. They implied that if I didn't sign, they might start looking for violations on my property too." Robert shook his head. "I've lived here for 10 years and never had any issues until this new board took over. They're like a bunch of bullies." "Thank you for telling me, Robert, and thank you for not signing their complaint." After Robert left, Margaret realized the situation was getting worse. They weren't just harassing her anymore, they were trying to turn her neighbors against her and intimidate anyone who might support her. The next morning brought a new surprise. Margaret found an envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the night. Inside was a typed letter with no signature. "Mrs. Thompson," it read, "your stubborn attitude is causing problems for everyone in this community. Some people are getting very frustrated with your refusal to cooperate. It would be unfortunate if something happened to your property or your animals because you won't listen to reason. Smart people know when to walk away." Margaret read the letter 3 times. In her career, she had received plenty of threats, but they usually came from criminals she was prosecuting, not from suburban homeowners associations. She made a copy of the letter and added it to her growing file of documentation. That afternoon, she decided to drive to the county courthouse to file formal complaints about the HOA's behavior. She had friends in the legal system who could advise her on the best way to handle this situation. But when she got to her truck, she found all 4 tires had been slashed. Margaret stood staring at her vehicle, feeling a cold anger building in her chest. In 30 years of prosecuting dangerous criminals, no one had ever vandalized her personal property. Now a homeowners association was escalating to property destruction. She called the police to report the vandalism. Officer Martinez, a young policeman she didn't recognize, took her statement but didn't seem very interested in investigating. "Probably just kids," he said, barely looking at the slashed tires. "Happens all the time in these suburban areas." "Officer, this isn't random. Vandalism," Margaret explained. "I'm being harassed by my local HOA, and this is clearly connected to that harassment." Officer Martinez shrugged. "Do you have any proof it was HOA related? Any witnesses?" Margaret realized she was getting nowhere. "No direct witnesses, but there's a clear pattern of escalating harassment. Without witnesses or evidence, there's not much we can do. You should probably just replace the tires and maybe install some security cameras." After the officer left, Margaret called her insurance company and a tow truck. While she waited, she noticed the white security SUV was back, parked about a block away. The guard was taking pictures again, probably documenting her abandoned vehicle. That evening, Margaret's phone rang. An unfamiliar number showed on the caller ID. "Mrs. Thompson." The voice was electronically distorted, clearly being run through some kind of voice changer. "You should have listened to our advice." "Who is this?" "Someone who wants to help you make the right decision. Your tires were just a warning." "Next time, we might not be so gentle with your horses." The line went dead. Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the phone. In all her years fighting crime, she had learned to recognize the difference between empty threats and serious ones. The mention of her horses crossed a line. These people were willing to hurt innocent animals to get what they wanted. She spent the next morning installing security cameras around her property and upgrading the locks on her barn and gates. If Derek Williamson and his associates wanted to play dirty, she would be ready for them. But Margaret underestimated just how far they were willing to go. 3 days later, she was working in her garden when she heard car doors slamming in her driveway. She looked up to see Derek Williamson walking toward her with 2 other men she didn't recognize. Both were wearing expensive suits and looked like lawyers or business associates. "Mrs. Thompson," Derek called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness. "We need to have a serious conversation." Margaret stood up, brushing dirt off her gardening gloves. "Mr. Williamson, this is private property. If you want to have a conversation, you can call and schedule an appointment." "This can't wait," one of the other men said. "We represent several development companies interested in this area. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property." Margaret looked at the 3 men standing uninvited on her. "Gentlemen, I've told Mr. Williamson before. My property is not for sale at any price." Derek's friendly mask slipped. "Mrs. Thompson, you're being unreasonable. This community is changing whether you like it or not. You can either profit from that change or be swept aside by it." "Is that a threat, Mr. Williamson?" "It's reality," the 3rd man spoke up. "Property values, insurance rates, tax assessments. Lots of things can make life expensive for people who don't adapt to changing neighborhoods." Margaret felt the familiar courtroom instincts kicking in. These men were making veiled threats, trying to intimidate her into selling. She had dealt with much more dangerous people than suburban bullies in expensive suits. "Gentlemen, I think this conversation is over. Please leave my property." Derek stepped closer. "We're trying to be reasonable here, but our patience isn't unlimited. Things could get much more difficult for you if you keep refusing to cooperate." Margaret looked Derek straight in the eye. "Mr. Williamson, I've spent 30 years dealing with people who think they can intimidate others into giving them what they want. You're not nearly as scary as you think you are." As the 3 men walked back to their car, Margaret heard Derek say to his companions, "She wants to do this the hard way. Fine. Let's show her what the hard way looks like." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Derek's parting words and the escalating pattern of harassment. The anonymous letter, the slashed tires, the threatening phone call. These people were clearly willing to break the law to get her property. She had handled dangerous criminals before, but this felt different. Criminals usually operated in the shadows, afraid of law enforcement. But Derek Williamson seemed confident that he could intimidate her openly, without consequences. Margaret realized she was dealing with something more dangerous than ordinary. Criminals. People with money and local influence who believed they were above the law. And she was about to discover just how far they were willing to go to prove it. Margaret was in her vegetable garden at 7 in the morning, enjoying the cool air before the Texas heat kicked in. She had her hands deep in the soil, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants, when she heard car doors slamming in her driveway. Again. She looked up, expecting to see Derek Williamson with more of his business associates. Instead, she saw 3 men in what looked like police uniforms walking toward her. They wore dark blue shirts with official-looking patches and carried themselves with the swagger that came with authority. Margaret stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her hands. Something felt wrong about this situation. Real police officers usually called ahead or at least knocked on the front door. These men were walking straight toward her garden like they owned the place. "Margaret Thompson?" the tallest officer called, out when he was still 20 feet away. "That's me. How can I help you, officers?" The 3 men approached her in a formation that immediately set off alarm bells in Margaret's mind. She had worked with law enforcement for 30 years and knew how real officers conducted themselves. These men were trying too hard to look official. "Ma'am, we're special HOA enforcement officers," the tall one announced, pulling out what looked like an official badge. "You're under arrest for criminal violations of community standards and trespassing on HOA common areas." Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry, what? Special HOA enforcement officers? There's no such thing." The second officer, a stocky man with a crew cut, stepped forward. Ma'am, we have legal authority to enforce HOA regulations when they rise to the level of criminal activity. Your continued violations have crossed that line. Margaret felt her lawyer instincts kicking in hard. Officers, I need to see your identification and any warrant you might have for my arrest. The third officer, who looked barely old enough to shave, pulled out a plastic zip tie from his belt. Ma'am, you need to come with us for processing. If you cooperate, this will go much easier. Processing where exactly? Margaret asked, taking a step backward. And criminal trespassing on HOA common areas? This is my own property. The tall officer was getting impatient. Ma'am, according to our investigation, you've been using community trails for your horses without permission, and your garden extends beyond your property line into HOA common space. Margaret almost laughed. Officer, I helped write some of the property laws in this state. My survey markers are clearly visible, and I haven't set foot on any community property. More importantly, HOA violations are civil matters, not criminal ones. The stocky officer moved closer. Ma'am, when someone repeatedly refuses to comply with lawful orders, it becomes criminal obstruction. Now please turn around and put your hands behind your back. Margaret's heart was racing, but her mind was crystal clear. In 30 years of legal work, she had never heard of HOA enforcement officers with arrest powers. She had prosecuted enough cases to know exactly what was happening here. Officers, I'm going to need you to show me your badges again, slowly, and I want to see your identification. The young officer looked nervous. Ma'am, you're being uncooperative. We have authority to use reasonable force if necessary. What department are you with? Margaret asked firmly. What's your badge number? The tall officer held up his badge, but when Margaret leaned in to read it clearly, she saw it said Pine Valley Security Services, in small print at the bottom. These weren't police officers at all. Gentlemen, you're not law enforcement officers, Margaret said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had used in courtrooms for decades. You're private security guards impersonating police officers, which is a felony in this state. The stocky officer's face turned red. Ma'am, we have legal authority granted by the HOA to make arrests for community violations. No, you don't, Margaret replied calmly. HOAs cannot grant arrest powers to anyone. Only certified law enforcement officers can make arrests, and only for actual crimes, not civil violations. The young officer was clearly uncomfortable now. Look, lady, we're just doing our job. Derek Williamson told us you were trespassing and needed to be brought in for questioning. Bingo! Margaret had her confirmation. Derek Williamson hired you to impersonate police officers and attempt to kidnap me from my own property. The tall officer realized his partner had just admitted too much. Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back or we'll be forced to restrain you. Margaret pulled out her cell phone. I'm calling the real police right now to report impersonation of law enforcement officers. The stocky officer lunged forward and tried to grab her phone. Ma'am, you're interfering with an official investigation. Margaret stepped back quickly. Despite being 67 years old, she was still in good shape from years of ranch work. Don't touch me. You have no legal authority here whatsoever. The young officer was clearly having second thoughts. Maybe we should just leave and let the HOA handle this through the courts. Shut up, Tommy, the tall officer snapped. Then he turned back to Margaret. Ma'am, last warning. Come with us voluntarily or we'll take you by force. Margaret held up her phone, which was now recording video. Perfect. Please repeat that threat while I'm recording. I'm sure the district attorney's office will be very interested in watching. Private security guards threatened to kidnap a 67-year-old woman. The three men looked at each other uncertainly. They clearly hadn't expected Margaret to know her rights or fight back so effectively. Ma'am, you're making this much harder than it needs to be, the stocky officer said. We're trying to help you resolve your issues with the community. By impersonating police officers and attempting to unlawfully detain me. Margaret kept her phone pointed at them. Gentlemen, you're digging yourselves deeper into legal trouble with every word. The tall officer made a decision. That's it. We're taking her in. He stepped forward and reached for Margaret's arm. She quickly stepped back and raised her voice. Help! I'm being attacked by men impersonating police officers. Her voice carried across the quiet morning air. In the distance, she could see her neighbor Robert coming out of his house to see what was happening. The young officer named Tommy was clearly panicking now. This is all wrong. We're supposed to be security guards, not kidnappers. Tommy, I swear, if you don't shut up, the tall officer hissed. Margaret seized the opportunity. Tommy, you seem like a decent young man. You don't want to go to prison for felony impersonation and kidnapping, do you? Because that's exactly where this is heading. Tommy looked at his partners, then back at Margaret. We were just told to bring you in for questioning about HOA violations. Nobody said anything about kidnapping. What you were told to do is irrelevant, Margaret explained, her voice becoming almost motherly. What matters is what you're actually doing, and what you're doing is impersonating law enforcement officers and attempting to unlawfully detain someone on their own property. The stocky officer was getting desperate. Look, we can work this out. Maybe we got our wires crossed about the legal authority thing, but you still need to address these HOA violations. Margaret shook her head. The only thing that needs to be addressed is your criminal behavior. I'm calling 911 right now. She dialed 911 while keeping the camera pointed at the three men. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Thompson at 1247 Ranch Road. I have 3 men on my property impersonating police officers and attempting to unlawfully detain me. I need real law enforcement here immediately. The tall officer realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Ma'am, hang up that phone. We can still work this out. Sir, move away from me or I'll add assault to the charges, Margaret warned. Within minutes, she could hear sirens in the distance. The 3 fake officers looked at each other with growing panic. We should go, Tommy said quietly. We can't leave. No, the stocky officer replied. We're in too deep. No, Margaret said firmly. You're exactly as deep as Derek Williamson intended you to be. He used you to do his dirty work, and now you're the ones facing felony charges while he sits safely in his office. As the real police cars pulled into her driveway, Margaret felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced since winning her last major case as Attorney General. Derek Williamson had finally overplayed his hand, and she had the evidence to prove it. The 3 fake officers stood frozen as real police officers approached with their hands on their weapons, clearly taking the impersonation report seriously. Margaret smiled grimly. Derek Williamson was about to learn that some people shouldn't be messed with, especially retired prosecutors who knew exactly how the legal system worked. The real police officers approached with their hands ready, clearly taking Margaret's call seriously. Detective Johnson, a woman in her 40s with graying hair, took charge of the scene immediately. Ma'am, are you Margaret Thompson who called? About impersonation of officers? Yes, Detective. These 3 men came to my property claiming to be special HOA enforcement officers with arrest powers. They attempted to detain me for supposed criminal violations of homeowner association rules. Detective Johnson looked at the 3 fake officers who were now standing very still with their hands visible. Gentlemen, I need to see your identification and any law enforcement credentials you might have. The tall fake officer fumbled for his wallet. Detective, there's been a misunderstanding. We work for Pine Valley Security Services. We were hired to investigate HOA violations. Were you representing yourselves as police officers? Detective Johnson asked sternly. Tommy, the young officer who had been having doubts, spoke up quietly. We were told we had special authority to make arrests for community violations. Detective Johnson's expression hardened. Son, there's no such thing as special HOA arrest authority. Only certified law enforcement officers can make arrests. Who told you that you had this authority? The stocky, fake officer tried to backtrack. Look, maybe there was some confusion about our role here. We're just private security doing our job. Margaret stepped forward. Detective, I have video evidence of them claiming to be law enforcement officers and threatening to take me by force. They also admitted that Derek Williamson hired them specifically for this purpose. Detective Johnson examined the fake badges the 3 men were carrying. These badges are designed to look like official law enforcement credentials. That's illegal. Impersonation right there. Within an hour, all 3 fake officers were in handcuffs in the back of police vehicles. Margaret gave a detailed statement about the entire incident, including the weeks of harassment that had led up to this morning's confrontation. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Johnson said as they finished the paperwork, "what these men did is serious. Impersonating law enforcement officers is a felony. Attempted kidnapping is an even bigger felony. We're going to investigate who hired them and why." Margaret smiled. "Detective, I have extensive documentation of the harassment campaign that preceded this incident. I think you'll find this goes much deeper than 3 security guards making bad decisions." That afternoon, Margaret received a call from the detective. "Mrs. Thompson, we've searched the security company's records and interviewed the 3 suspects. They've provided us with text messages and emails from Derek Williamson, specifically instructing them to use whatever authority necessary to bring you in for questioning." "What does that mean for Derek?" Margaret asked. "It means he's looking at charges for conspiracy to commit impersonation of law enforcement officers, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and criminal intimidation. We're executing search warrants on his home and office tomorrow morning." Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of a case coming together, but she wasn't done yet. Her legal mind was already working on the bigger picture. The next morning, she drove to the office of her former colleague, District Attorney Patricia Rodriguez. Patricia had worked under Margaret years ago and was now one of the most respected prosecutors in the state. "Margaret, what brings you out of retirement?" Patricia asked with a warm smile. "Someone tried to have me kidnapped from my own property yesterday using fake police officers," Margaret said simply. Patricia's smile faded immediately. "Tell me everything." Margaret spent 2 hours walking Patricia through the entire harassment campaign, from the first violation notices to yesterday's fake arrest attempt. She provided copies of all her documentation, including photos, violation notices, threatening letters, and video evidence. "Margaret, this is incredible," Patricia said, flipping through the files. "This isn't just criminal impersonation. This is a conspiracy to use intimidation and fraud to force you off your property. That's criminal coercion, possibly even organized. Crime territory." "I was hoping you'd see it that way," Margaret replied. "I want to pursue this to the full extent of the law." "You don't even need to ask. Derek Williamson and anyone else involved are going to face serious consequences." That evening, Margaret's phone rang. It was a reporter from the local newspaper. "Mrs. Thompson, we heard about the fake police incident at your ranch. Would you be willing to talk about what happened?" Margaret considered for a moment. "Yes, I think it's important for people to know about this." The story ran the next day with the headline, "Retired Attorney General Catches Fake Police Sent by HOA." By noon, Margaret's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, neighbors, and other homeowners who had their own HOA horror stories. Channel 7 News called that afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to do a feature story about HOA abuse and what happened to you. Would you be interested in an on-camera interview?" Margaret agreed. She had spent her career in the public eye, and she knew the power of media attention to expose wrongdoing. The interview aired 3 days later. Margaret sat calmly in her living room, with her ranch visible through the window behind her, and told her story in clear, simple terms. "People need to understand that homeowner associations are not law enforcement agencies," she explained to the reporter. "They cannot send fake police to your home, they cannot threaten you or intimidate you, and they certainly cannot try to force you off property you legally own." The reporter asked, "What would you tell other homeowners who might be facing similar situations?" "Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to fight back through proper legal channels. Bullies count on people being too scared or too tired to stand up to them." Within days, the story had been picked up by news outlets across the state. Margaret started receiving calls from homeowners as far away as California and Florida, all dealing with aggressive HOA tactics. But the media attention also brought unexpected consequences. Margaret's lawyer called with surprising news. "Margaret, I've been contacted by 3 other homeowners in Pine Valley Estates who want to file complaints against the HOA. Apparently your case has given them courage to come forward with their own stories." "What kind of stories?" "Harassment, intimidation, selective enforcement of rules, financial irregularities." One family says the HOA tried to foreclose on their home over a $50 late fee. Another says they were fined $1,000 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Margaret wasn't surprised. In her experience, people who abused power rarely limited themselves to one victim. There's more, her lawyer continued. The state attorney general's office has opened an investigation into HOA practices statewide. They're using your case as a starting point to look into whether other HOAs are operating outside the law. Margaret smiled. Sometimes one case could create ripple effects that helped far more people than just the original victim. 3 days later, Derek Williamson was arrested at his office. The charges included conspiracy to commit impersonation of law enforcement officers, criminal coercion, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and fraud. 2 other HOA board members were also arrested as co-conspirators. The local newspaper ran photos of Derek being led away in handcuffs with the headline, "HOA President Arrested for Fake Police Scheme." That evening, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of coffee watching her horses graze in the pasture. Her phone had finally stopped ringing constantly, and she could enjoy the peaceful sunset she had been fighting to protect. Her neighbor, Robert, walked over from his house. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you for standing up to those people. The whole neighborhood is talking about how brave you were." "Robert, I wasn't being brave. I was just refusing to be bullied off my own land." "Well, whatever you call it, you've made life better for all of us." The new interim HOA board already announced they're reviewing all the excessive fines and violations from the past year. As Robert walked back to his house, Margaret reflected on the strange turn her retirement had taken. She had thought her days of fighting legal battles were over. Instead, she had found herself in the middle of one of the most satisfying cases of her career. Derek Williamson had made one critical mistake. He had assumed that because Margaret was retired and living quietly on her ranch, she would be an easy target. He never bothered to research who he was really dealing with. Margaret had spent 30 years as Attorney General because she never backed down from bullies, no matter how powerful they thought they were. And retirement hadn't changed that about her one bit. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the courtroom where she had once prosecuted cases as Attorney General. But this time, she was on the other side as the victim and star witness in what had become the biggest HOA abuse case in state history. Derek Williamson sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the confident bully who had once threatened her on her own property. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His real estate empire had crumbled when news of his criminal charges scared away investors and business partners. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the evidence will show that Derek Williamson orchestrated a criminal conspiracy to force Mrs. Thompson off her legally owned property through intimidation, harassment, and ultimately the use of fake law enforcement officers." Margaret watched as the prosecutor laid out the case she had helped build. Text messages between Derek and the security company showing his instructions to use whatever authority necessary. Financial records proving Derek's real estate company stood to profit millions from developing her land. Testimony from other homeowners about similar intimidation tactics. The 3 fake officers had already pleaded guilty and testified against Derek in exchange for reduced sentences. Tommy, the young security guard who had shown remorse, received probation and community service. The other 2 got 2 years each. But Derek had refused all plea deals, convinced his lawyers could get him off. He was about to learn that Margaret's documentation and legal expertise had built an airtight case. When Margaret took the witness stand, the courtroom was packed. Local news crews filled the back rows, and many of her neighbors had come to support her. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "when the defendants first started harassing you, did you ever imagine it would escalate to fake police officers trying to arrest you?" Margaret looked directly at Derek as she answered, "In 30 years, as Attorney General, I learned that people who abuse power rarely stop on their own. They keep pushing until someone pushes back harder." What would you tell other homeowners facing similar situations? That knowledge is power. Know your rights, document everything, and don't let anyone intimidate you off property you legally own. And remember that no matter how official someone looks or sounds, real police officers follow proper procedures and respect the law. Derek's lawyer tried to make Margaret look vindictive during cross-examination. Mrs. Thompson, isn't it true that you could have avoided all this by simply working with the HOA to address legitimate community concerns? Margaret's response was calm and precise. Counselor, there were no legitimate community concerns. My property predates the HOA by 20 years and has legal protections that your client chose to ignore. His real goal was never community standards. It was forcing me to sell valuable land for his development projects. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Derek Williamson was sentenced to 18 months in prison and banned from serving on any HOA board for life. He was also ordered to pay Margaret's legal fees and damages totaling over $200,000. But Margaret's victory went far beyond one criminal conviction. 3 weeks after the trial, she received a call from the state legislature. Mrs. Thompson, we're introducing the Homeowner Protection Act based on your case. Would you be willing to testify in support of the legislation? The new law would strictly limit HOA enforcement powers, require transparent financial reporting, and create criminal penalties for HOA officials who abuse their authority. Margaret's case had become the catalyst for protecting homeowners across the entire state. Margaret drove to the state capitol and testified before the legislature. Honorable members, homeowner associations serve important purposes when they operate within the law. But when they operate like criminal organizations, homeowners need legal protection. The Homeowner Protection Act passed unanimously in both houses and was signed into law by the governor. Margaret was invited to the signing ceremony and stood behind the governor as he made the legislation official. Back home in Pine Valley Estates, life had dramatically improved. The old HOA board was dissolved, and a new board was elected with strict oversight requirements. All the excessive fines from Derek's reign were canceled, and several families who had been forced to sell their homes were compensated. Margaret's neighbor Robert stopped by one evening with good news. Margaret, you'll never guess what happened. The new HOA board voted to designate your property as a protected historical ranch. They're actually using your horses and garden as selling points for the neighborhood now. Margaret laughed. From community eyesore to historical landmark in 1 year, that's got to be some kind of record. The security company that provided the fake officers went out of business after facing dozens of lawsuits from other victims. It turned out Derek had used them for intimidation tactics across multiple properties he wanted to acquire. 6 months later, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. A young woman knocked on her door, introducing herself as Linda Chen, a law student writing her thesis on property rights. Mrs. Thompson, your case is being taught in law schools now as an example of how to fight back against abuse of power. Would you mind if I interviewed you for my research? Margaret invited Linda in for coffee and spent the afternoon sharing her story. The most important lesson, Margaret told her, is that legal knowledge is worthless if you don't have the courage to use it. And sometimes the most important cases happen after you think your career is over. Linda asked, do you regret not just selling your property and avoiding all this trouble? Margaret looked out the window at her horses grazing in the afternoon sun. Linda, this ranch isn't just property to me. It's the home my husband and I built together. It's where our dreams lived. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. A year later, Margaret's story was featured in a book about landmark property rights cases. She donated the proceeds to a legal aid fund helping homeowners fight HOA abuse. The Pine Valley Estates community thrived under proper HOA management. Property values increased not because Margaret was forced out, but because the neighborhood became known as a place where residents' rights were respected and protected. Derek Williamson was released from prison after serving his full sentence. His real estate license was permanently revoked, and he left town quietly. The last Margaret heard, he was working as a used car salesman in another state. Tommy, the young security guard who had shown remorse, visited Margaret after completing his community service. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to apologize again and thank you for how you handled everything. You could have destroyed my life, but you showed mercy. Margaret had recommended leniency for Tommy because he had been honest about what happened and had clearly learned from his mistakes. Tommy, Everyone deserves a second chance when they're truly sorry and willing to change. 2 years after the fake arrest incident, Margaret was named Citizen of the Year by the State Bar Association for her work protecting homeowner rights. At the ceremony, she was asked to give advice to young lawyers. The law isn't just about winning cases or making money, she told the audience. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves and standing up to those who abuse power. Sometimes your most important case will come when you least expect it. Today, Margaret still lives peacefully on her ranch. Her horses are older but still healthy, and her garden produces the best tomatoes in the county. Neighbors often stop by to ask for legal advice or just to visit with the woman who took on an entire HOA and won. She keeps busy mentoring young lawyers, volunteering with property rights organizations, and enjoying the retirement she had always planned. The harassment that once made her life miserable has become a distant memory, replaced by the satisfaction of a battle well fought and justice properly served. Sometimes on quiet evenings, as she sits on her porch watching the sunset, Margaret reflects on how her fight against Derek Williamson ended up helping thousands of homeowners across the state. Her refusal to be bullied off her own land had created protections for people she would never meet. It was, she often thought, the most important case of her entire career, and it had happened when she was supposed to be retired.